So what do we mean when we say presentation flow? Well, one of the biggest challenges for long and complex slide decks is to make it easy for your reader to understand your argument without getting lost. This is presentation flow and it's quite tricky to nail. But over the years, the top consulting firms have developed a few techniques that they use to ensure that their slide decks have presentation flow. And in this video, I'm going to teach you the 3 ones that you need to know. The first method is used when you have 2 slides back to back that you want to connect. So for example, you might have an argument that requires 2 sets of data and you can't fit them on a single slide, but you want your reader to understand that both of those slides are making a combined point. You might remember a concept called action titles, and action titles are the text that sit at the top of the slide and describe the implication or the so what of the slide. Now we can strategically use action titles to link to slides, and the way that we do this is using something called ellipses. And ellipses are just the 3 dots in a row. It looks something like this. So as you can see in this slide, the action title is saying that Melbourne ranks 1st in Australia and 3rd in Asia as a cultural city. And you can see the data below supports that action title very clearly. But you can also see that there are 3 dots after the word Asia, and that implies that the next slide is connected to this slide. And if we go to the next slide, we can see that it continues by saying, and 12th out of 38 of the world's cultural and creative cities. And again, there's data below that to support it. But as you flick through the 2 slides, you can see that there's one action title that's split by ellipses, so the dots, and it connects the 2 slides together. Now there are only 2 rules that you need to remember about using ellipses to connect slides together. The first one is that the 2 action titles need to be readable as one continuous sentence, like they are in the BCG example that we just looked at. And secondly, both the action titles on both of the slides need to be fully supported by the data that sits in the slide body. Again, just like the BCG example that we looked at. If you've ever looked at a McKinsey, BCG or Bain presentation, you will have come across buttons that are strategically used throughout the presentation. These buttons are linking the slides together. And to show you an example, I'm going to pull it from my Executive Communication and Storytelling with PowerPoint course. And if you're interested in that, I'll drop a link in the description below. But let's look at the example. So as you can see in this slide, BCG introduced something called the Performance Index. And you can see that there are kind of yellow buttons across that slide. So I can see here they've got 6 buttons from A to F. Now these buttons are important because later in the presentation, they're going to use these to help the reader understand what part of the index they're referring to in subsequent slides. So here you can see in a later slide in the deck, they have a table of information, and that information is cut up based on the different components of the performance index. And we know this because they've used the buttons across the top to link each of the different columns with different parts of the performance index in the framework slide that we saw earlier. So this is how they've used buttons to improve the flow and help the reader understand what they're looking at. And then we continue on the next slide to see that they've reintroduced the framework with more information that's specifically about Melbourne, but again, they've used the buttons. And then finally, they go deep into each of the components of Performance Index. And we know this because each of the slides at the top on the left-hand side have the buttons. So the slide that we're looking at now is looking at the first component, component A of the Performance Index framework. And BCG will use the buttons throughout the presentation so the reader knows that as we're going into the detail and out of the detail, exactly where they are and which part of the framework that they're looking at. So that's how you use buttons to improve the flow of your presentation. And again, there are only 2 rules for using buttons. The first rule is that you should only use 1 set of buttons for any presentation. Don't try and have different sets of different colors, one of letters, one of numbers. It gets very confusing for the reader to keep those different frameworks in their mind. So try to limit it to 1 set of buttons per presentation. And the second rule, make sure the style of the buttons is consistent throughout the presentation. So keep the color the same, keep the font the same, and where you can also keep the size the same. So it helps the reader understand very quickly what they're looking at. And this final method of improving presentation flow, it's used when you have a long slide deck with multiple chapters, sub-chapters, sections, etc. And as you can imagine, when you have those kind of presentations, it becomes really difficult for an unfamiliar reader to keep track of where they are in the presentation. So again, it breaks the flow of the presentation. So to improve the flow, you can use something called section trackers. And section trackers sit at the top of the slide above the action title, and they basically just state where in the presentation that particular slide sits. It helps communicate when the reader is moving from one chapter to the next. It helps them understand, just like the other things, exactly where they are in the presentation. Plus it also makes it quite easy to flick through the slides and find a particular section if that's of interest to the reader. So this is the McKinsey presentation, and you can see the top left of the slide they've used in red chapter trackers. So if you're a reader and you land on this slide, you know that you're looking at the chapter called Base Case. And as you flick through the slides, you can see that they've also added a little bit more detail about where the particular slide fits in the base case chapter tracker. So for example, in this slide, it says base case revenue projection. So we know that we're looking at a revenue projection for the base case. So that's quite useful. So as we flick through the presentation, we can see that this particular slide doesn't have a chapter tracker, but it does have two boxes that are different colors. And this is interesting because it's introducing new chapter trackers for us, or new chapters for us. So you can see we have yellow, actions within the Postal Service control, and green, fundamental change. And as we continue through the slides, we can see up in the top left, we now have new chapters. This one saying actions within Postal Service control. And we continue to flick through, and now we've reached fundamental change. So you can see they've introduced the chapters in a slide and then subsequently used chapter trackers to help the reader understand which of the two sections they're in. On this slide, it's also very interesting because we can see here that there's three different things on the right-hand side of the slide: base case, actions within Postal Service control, and fundamental change. And if you remember, they were our three chapter trackers. And the coloring is consistent between what's on this page and also what was the color of the chapter trackers. So this is really important because not only have McKinsey used chapter trackers, but when they mention the chapters within the body of the slides, they've kept everything consistent. In particular, the coloring is consistent. So you know that when you're reading the slide or reading the chapter trackers, we're talking about the same thing. So there's only one rule for chapter trackers, and that is to ensure that the formatting is consistent across everything. And as we saw, McKinsey did just that. So if you got something from this video, please hit the like button and the subscribe button. It's a tiny gesture, but it would really mean a lot to me. And somewhere on the screen, you'll see a video about action titles. So if you want to learn more about how to write action titles, best practices, and some examples from top consulting firms like McKinsey, feel free to click on the video and check it out.